Guys, welcome to The Disruptors, the show where we talk about the future, the problems, and how to solve them. Today we've got somebody who's handling a lot of those problems. Cindy Cohn on the program. Cindy, thanks for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's kick things off with a big question. Are you more worried about censorship or freedom of speech today?
Um, Whoops, I'm sorry about that. Let me start over. I'm sorry. I realized I just accidentally turned off the recorder. There we go. Um, so can you click me out and I can just answer the question again?
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So Cindy, what are you more worried about today? The state of freedom of speech in the press, or what we're seeing in terms of content curation and censorship?
Well, I think they're intertwined, right? Because if we don't get the balance right in terms of freedom of speech, then we end up with, people not being able to speak, which is, not, and marginalized voices, especially not being able to speak. If we go too far on the censorship side, we also mean that people cannot speak. So if you're really, to me, concerned about freedom of speech, you have to actually find a balance between the two. It's not one or the other.
How do we find that balance, and how do we do it in a way that works for everybody?
Well, I think we have to center the user. We have to center the speaker in the conversation, and we have a long way to go before we do that. But I think the first thing we need to do is we need to have some much better insights into what's going on with our speech online, especially with the big platforms. I mean, anybody who has looked at the situation says that the black box way in which the big tech companies are doing their content moderation leaves everybody the worse off, because it's difficult to tell how decisions are being made. There's no appeal process. There's no transparency into these things. And I think it's fair to say that, rich, important people get favoritism in this system. I mean, anybody who's watched Twitter knows that the best way to get a response from Twitter is to be a celebrity, right? That's not right either. So the first thing that we've done is we have worked with a bunch of other organizations to come up with something called the Santa Clara Principles, which are just basic due process principles around transparency and decision making by people who host other people's speech. And once we get a picture on that, we can do a better job of figuring out what's going on and where we might need to make some shifts. But right now, I think that a lot of people have correctly diagnosed that there's a problem and are rushing to solutions without enough information.
Because everyone's essentially saying, oh, I'm being underrepresented, regardless of what the data says.
Right, and this is one of the things that I think makes the situation pretty dangerous, is that there's a lot of people mad at the big tech companies, and frankly, I have no lost love for them. I think they've done a lot of wrong things, but they're actually mad at them for completely different reasons, right? We just testified, my colleague Corinne McSherry just testified in Congress yesterday, and a chunk of Congress is mad because they feel like conservative voices are being censored too much by these platforms. And another chunk of Congress is mad because they feel like hateful speakers are not being censored enough. So these two things don't point to a single solution. In fact, they point in very different directions. And again, I think some transparency, some real due process on behalf of the platforms would be a really good place to start.
Speaking of due process, how do we handle rules? I'm pretty sure the president's broken all of Twitter's rules at this point, almost daily.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's true. I think you're in I think Twitter's in a bunch of a conundrum because, the president is, he's news, right? In addition to being obnoxious on Twitter, there's news that happens in what the president says, and I think it's important that, we as citizens be informed about what our president is doing and saying, which makes him in a slightly different category than just you or me. And I'm not sure what Twitter should do in this situation, but I think whatever they do, it ought to be rule-based and defensible and not a one-off situation for one guy.
And I know for you guys with the EFF, freedom of speech is a really big deal. How close to libertarian are you in terms of anything goes for free speech?
Well, I think that it really depends on which libertarian you're talking to. There's not really I don't think there's a single definition, and I don't think free speech is only a libertarian concern. I actually would fight your hypo a little bit. I mean, free speech is written in the United States Constitution. It's something that people of all political stripes need. And can use. I mean, I think of EFF's role as we're kind of like the plumbers of freedom, right? We try to get obstacles out of the way of empowering users. And freedom of speech is clearly one of the most important tools. And we work with people all over the world, very far from the American political context at all, who are desperately trying to get their voices heard. And really, I think that it doesn't fit very well into the current political framing of the United States. Freedom of expression, it's not just a U.S. value, right? It's in all the international human rights treaties and agreements as well. So, our view is that the goal ought to be that everybody on the planet can have their voice heard, and that consequences for speech that causes harm should fall on the speaker.
What do you think about some of the European initiatives and some of what Germany's done? So they have freedom of speech with some caveats. So one of the caveats being you can't be a Nazi. And it seems to work well. You don't see a lot of white rhetoric hate speech coming from Germany as much. Yet at the flip side, there are potential dangers. Who decides? How do you think about the caveats to free speech? Is that a good idea, or is it too slippery of a slope?
Well, I don't think that Germany is doing any better than we are when it comes to white supremacy. I mean, they just had a guy tried to shoot up a synagogue during Yom Kippur services. White supremacy is on the rise all across Europe, as well as in the United States. And I don't think that the difference in the rules about free speech are making any significant difference in the rise of this. And it's one of the things I think that if at the time you're trying to stop hate is the time where people are speaking it, you're way late in the process, right? I mean, we need to work on stopping the rise of authoritarianism and white supremacist hate far before it gets to the place where somebody's saying something online, if we're going to ever have a hope to do it. And again, I look at Austria, which has those same anti-Nazi rules. Look at Germany. I don't think that free speech that cutting back on free speech is going to get people who are concerned to their goals, because we are not seeing a significant difference between the countries that have anti-Nazi laws, anti-hate speech laws, and the countries that don't.
But we do see a lot less on the platforms. And let's play devil's advocate. We wouldn't have a flat earth movement if it wasn't for people creating YouTube videos and getting sucked down the rabbit hole, so to speak. And the only reason why mostly suckers and kids are falling for this is because they're finding those rabbit holes to begin with.
Well, I think that the flat Earth movement existed before there was an internet, but I do think that you've got your finger on something, which is important, which is, the algorithmic decision making about what people say next. This suck down the rabbit hole idea isn't purely a free speech thing. These are algorithmic decisions about what you're seeing next, whether that's on YouTube or other things that are in control of the companies and that are a proper place for us to put some pressure on them. I think it's really hard to come up with rules that would fit in a legal framework, but I think it's perfectly legitimate for us to go to these companies and say, you've prioritized keeping us outraged because that keeps us on the platform, right? I mean, this is the realization of our time, which is if you want to keep people on a platform, keep them pissed off and angry and feeling like they're the victims of some big conspiracy. That keeps people engaged, and the problem is that's pretty toxic for our society as a whole. So I think that it's perfectly legitimate to talk to the platforms that are doing algorithmic recommendations and algorithmic sorting about what it is they're doing and why they're doing it, and really push them to make some changes. I think that's very legitimate, but I think that the part where you're trying to decide who gets to, where you want these companies to decide who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak is extremely dangerous, won't work. They're lousy at it. and will backfire against marginalized people. One of the things that I think is important, and we try to say this a lot, is, EFF has been around for 30 years. And I've been at EFF for nearly 20 of those. And we spend a lot of time looking at who struggles to get their voice heard online and who doesn't. And historically, it's marginalized people. They are the first ones to go when there's a censorship regime. They have the hardest time getting their voice out there in the first place. So when you put pressure on these companies to censor, and they proudly announce that they've taken down thousands of people's speech, that doesn't fall necessarily in the way that you would make those decisions, or that we as a society might decide to make those decisions. That invariably falls on marginalized voices. And unless we reckon with that fact, we're not going to help marginalized voices by encouraging more censorship. We're ultimately going to hurt this. And we see this, right? We see people who are engaged in democracy activism, whether, it's places like Hong Kong or here at home, they get flagged as engaging in hate speech. There's the Black Lives Matter people get flagged for hate speech. The people, again, so I think you have to worry about what the tools are that you're embracing here, and reckon with the chances of backfire before moving in. And that's one of the reasons why we are very, very nervous about, say, reforms to Section 230, which is the kind of secondary liability that has been floated for platforms for the speech of their users. It's going to incentivize platforms against letting anybody, towards something that looks more like that has censorship that. Say this more clearly, we've seen that those kinds of pressures lead to censorship of marginalized voices far more often than they lead to censorship of majority voices.
Well, they also lead to censorship of startups, because then the startups aren't able to comply. You create the incumbent that cannot be killed.
Absolutely. And of course, I know this is disrupt. I should have fronted that one. There's multiple arguments for why this is a bad idea, but the biggest one, and my colleague Elliot Harmon just got an editorial in the New York Times today on just this point about, the anti-competitive effects of getting rid of creating secondary liability for platforms. And, we had a great example of this, or an awful example of this, depending on your position. Congress just last year passed a law called FOSTA, which was nominally aimed at getting sex trafficking off of these platforms. It created secondary liability for platforms when there's sex trafficking occurring on them, which is a serious problem. But what happened? A whole bunch of platforms that hosted dating or dating systems, and Craigslist dropped their dating ad, Tumblr dropped a bunch of stuff that had been used for dating, and Facebook moved in. They now have a dating service. Why? Because they're big and they can handle the need to do that kind of pre-screening of every single message, and the little guys couldn't. So, I think you also have to pay really, really close attention to what responsibilities you're putting on secondary, on platforms, because it's going to be just, if you care about the competition issues that we're facing right now, which is something that we're paying increasing attention to, and I think we're all seeing that as having an impact on our civil liberties. Creating more burdens for the big tech companies without paying attention to the anti-competitive effects is really problematic.
Which of the big tech companies are you most worried about, and why?
Well, I think it depends on what you're concerned about. I mean, I think that, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft are all big, and they have different kinds of problems. So, for Apple, I think they've done a really good job at standing up for privacy, but they really do try to lock you in to their system, and it's really hard to get out of it. They do a lot of handcuffing people into their system, whether it's through their apps or their services or things like that. And so I think that's a problem on one level. I think that Facebook is a privacy nightmare for people. I think Google's a privacy nightmare for people, and Google, and they both do different kinds of tracking of users. And then, feeding that into the system of tracking, the whole ecosystem of, slicing and dicing you and trying to feed you content that you want, which is itself then gets reified, right? This is how this algorithmic decision making that leads people to more extreme positions is part of a business model. And both Facebook and Google are big purveyors of that. I think Amazon has its own issues. Certainly, we are very unhappy with Amazon right now because of the Ring partnerships that they have with police. To try to, surveil formerly public places. And, there's I think a big single point of failure with the Amazon Web Services is the back end to everything everybody does that makes me increasingly nervous. So I think, I'm not sure I want to rank them, but I think that there are anti-competitive concerns about all of them. And then more importantly, for me, I'm increasingly seeing a problem where people aren't developing new technologies because they want to be a competitor, but instead developing technologies in order to be bought by the big guys, which is a very different, I mean, a little of that has always happened, but now I don't see the other pathway existing at all. So it used to be that if somebody put out a system, a service that didn't serve you, you could vote with your feet and just leave and go and take your things up. I mean, that's, people used MySpace and then they decided that Facebook was better and they moved to Facebook. But, Facebook has become kind of the Roach Motel of social networks, right? You check in, but you can never check out. I think that the breaking of that system is something we're seeing across a lot of about the ecosystem. And that's the problem that I'm concerned about. It's not any particular tech company. It's the fact that they don't compete with each other, and there's really only 4 or 5 places to go, and it's stifling new entrants.
Do you think we need to break up the tech companies, split YouTube from Google, split WhatsApp and Instagram from Facebook?
I think that's one thing that should be considered. I think that's actually really hard. There are lots of other things that we could do, that we might be able to do more quickly. I mean, I'm not opposed to them, but as a lawyer, that pathway is not all that easy, given the current law. I think that we could do a lot to require what my colleague Cory Doctorow calls adversarial interoperability, a way to interoperate with these current ones, so that you don't necessarily have to break them up, but you can reduce their power by giving people other options within the system. I used to joke that I still joke sometimes that I look forward to the day when Facebook is just another node on the Mastodon Fediverse, right? Like, I don't think people have to. So what I would rather see, I think it's fine. I'm not opposed to breaking things up, but sometimes instead of shooting for the moon, you might shoot for a couple steps forward, and pushing these companies to reopen their interfaces, to embrace standards for interoperability rather than closed and controllable APIs. Facebook got so much of our contact data because it let you upload all your Google contacts, right? And now Facebook won't let those go anywhere else. There's lots of places. And again, we've written a whole series of blog posts about different kinds of adversarial interoperability. And I think that ought to be on the menu of anybody who's concerned about competition, because it's something we can do much more quickly than I think we're going to be able to do something like breakups.
Well, I think the YouTube Google one just makes sense. Imagine how much money YouTube would be worth split off. Same thing with Instagram at this point. Facebook's kind of like the dying horse. You just need to take it out back and shoot it and let the other two run, because that's kind of where it's headed. No one really uses Facebook anymore, do they? Other than mostly kind of middle-aged Americans that love to check in on their kids and their kids' kids.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't fall for the fallacy that the only people who count are young people. In terms of advertising revenue, it's a pretty big chunk from just Facebook itself right now. Again, I'm not opposed to breaking it up, but I don't think that, I guess the difference between the way that you're thinking about it and maybe the way I think about it is I'm much more of a tactician and a strategy person. And so I think about what could we actually do and what are the hurdles to doing it. So I think that that breaking WhatsApp off from Facebook will be easier than breaking Instagram off from Facebook. And I think that, so again, I don't disagree with you about, like, if we were sitting in a white room and we had a big whiteboard and we were trying to decide what we ought to do, what would be the sensible things that would be on our list. I'm much more steeped in what the law looks like and what the pathway looks like to get from here to there. And when I look at those, I think that breaking up is fine. And I don't think we should stop that pressure, because that pressure may help with other things. It's the other thing about policy making and lawmaking is if you put some pressure here, sometimes you can help make things happen over there. But I think that adversarial interoperability ought to be on the list of things that we demand. And that can include some very simple legal reforms, like reforming the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which treats some forms of interoperability as if they are criminal hacking, right? We've seen cases like the LinkedIn HiQ case recently, where LinkedIn tried to argue that somebody who was scraping the public information on LinkedIn was breaking federal hacking laws. So CFAA could use to be reformed. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which has very limited ability for people to do reverse engineering in the context of something that's showing content. And user license agreements that prevent people from building interoperable or competitive products. These are all very not hard things to do.
How do you do it without regulation, though? So regulating that they have to do it, and then thereby making it harder for the up-and-comers to create something because they also have to be interoperable.
I don't think you have to push them to do it. I think you have to stop making it criminal for them to do it, right? You have to take away what is now a punishment for trying to do it and make it a level playing field. That's very different than mandating that they have to. Of course, we could do that too. The FCC, the reason that we can all plug anything we want to into the wall, back in the day when you had to do that in order to have a modem to get on the internet, and the telephone companies said, oh, we can't possibly let you plug anything else into your phone thing because it'll blow up the system. And the FCC said, no, you have to let people plug other devices into the wall, not just your own phones. And that's why we all got modems back in the day. So there's roles that regulators can play to level the playing field and require this. But in the context of the CFAA, the DMCA, and end user license agreements, we just have to say, look, it's unenforceable. You cannot sue or send the cops after somebody who is interoperating with your product for competitive purposes. You just and then you level that playing field. You don't have to, so yes, mandates can be interesting, but right now what we have are barriers, and the easy thing to do is to get the barriers down. And again, I'm not saying, we are looking very closely at antitrust law and competition law and unfair competition law, and frankly the Europeans are going to do a lot of work in this area too. So it's not like those things are mutually exclusive, but I feel like a lot of people who think about this immediately rush to the breakup model, because that's kind of what we all remember with AT&T. And that's not the only way, and shouldn't be the only way that we think about bringing more competition to this space.
Yeah, it's just the one that sounds sexy. It's like with the Apple iPhone repairs, and you got to be a licensed repairer, or you got to have licensed Apple products. It's a scam and a monopoly, and somehow it's allowed to continue on.
And there's cases about this, from cars, right? It used to be, you had to use genuine GM parts to fix a car, and there was a whole set of legal cases about your right to use something else. But right now we're seeing Apple doing the same thing. Of course, some of the worst and the biggest I think frustrations for a lot of people is what printer companies do, right? To try to make sure that, they give you this cheap printer and then they charge you $1 zillion for the ink. And then they do all sorts of things to try to prevent you from using off-market ink products. And I just think that we ought to put a lot more pressure on the people who build us our technologies to allow interoperability, and we should punish them if they don't.
I would agree. The big problem is you don't think about it before you buy it. You buy it and then you're like, oh, shoot.
Yeah, but Consumer Reports should be reporting on it. We can all learn these things, right? And they just shouldn't be able to do it, right? I mean, just be Lexmark sued, a company that made off-market printer cartridges, and that poor company ultimately went under before the case ended. But that ought to be not possible, right? We should change the law. It's compared to changing antitrust law, this is a much smaller lift, and say, interoperating with someone is a value that we have. It's in public policy favors interoperability, and we are not gonna allow any of these laws or any contractual terms to be enforced if they get rid of if they don't allow for interoperability. We do this in lots of other places in contract law, right? It's in California where I'm based. It's void against public policy to try to lock somebody into, to not let somebody take their next job, by blocking them out of a whole industry by a non-compete agreement. That's just not enforceable under California law because it's void against public policy. We could very easily say not allowing interoperability by a competitor into your product is void as against public policy in the state of California. Or federally, and open up a lot of spaces that have been blocked, because it's pretty hard to get funding for something if your funding model is, well, first we have to withstand the lawsuit and then we can provide the product.
Exactly. And then there's the whole flip side argument, the splinter net, China, and then more recently, Chinese, not curation per se, but more capitalist censorship from a communist country. Talk a little bit more about what's been happening and where you guys are at.
Well, we certainly have been blogging about it and writing about it. I will say that our ability as an American NGO with a bunch of American lawyers to really have do the kind of activist litigation work that is kind of centered to what EFF does in China is zero, right? Like we don't have the ability to use the levers of the NGO community that we have here in China, but we certainly have been watching it, and I think that the Hong Kong protesters have been amazingly adept at kind of using some of those, protecting themselves against facial recognition, recognizing how to have secure communications in a very, very hostile environment, and manage to keep their movement going despite tremendous efforts. But you're right. The Chinese government has been amazing at basically conscripting lots of ordinary people into, serving as their censors and propaganda arm. And I think that is a very big problem. And to me, as a matter of kind of statecraft, it's really sad that the American government, which used to spend a lot of energy supporting people who are doing this, has been pretty quiet about this process. And in fact, instead of seeing it as a human rights problem, looks like they're more trying to emulate it than they're trying to fight it.
And then there's Apple, who's pulling the Hong Kong protesters' apps. You've got the NBA coach who's tweeting about the Hong Kong situation, and then the league coming down on them. There's so much money in China because of the population that companies they're turning the other eye and saying, be my guest.
Yeah, I think it's really problematic. And I think that it's, we need civil society around the world and the governments that stand for human rights around the world to create another pole to say, look, you as a company, you've got to decide if you're going to play with those dictators, like you're not going to be able to participate over here. And we are going to decide with our money, with our attention, with our help, governments help companies all around the world to try to get contracts and deals and stuff like that. Like, we are not going to help you unless you're on the side of freedom, unless you're on the side of human rights. And, again, the American government has largely exited the stage in terms of doing this. And I think Europe has not stood up as much as they ought to. But I think that if there's only the pull of the corrupt dictatorship, and there's not a counterpole for freedom and human rights around the world, you're going to see companies feel like, they'd be a fool if they didn't participate in this way. But it wasn't always so, and it doesn't have to be so again.
Well, it's the collective action problem. It's climate change. It's everybody pooping in the toilet, and who cleans the toilet. It's when everyone else benefits and I don't benefit. I got to benefit, right? How do we deal with that?
Well, it's also, again, I think it comes back, in, at least in terms of things like Apple, it comes back to us not having very good other choices, right? It comes back to competition, right? I mean, somebody could come and eat their lunch and say, look, you don't want to,
Huawei
we've
almost
seen
did.
this. Yeah, well, we've seen in areas about clothes or makeup or sports equipment, right? Patagonia by saying, "Look, we're not going to play with these bad guys. We're not going to be. We're not. We care about the environment. We are going to work in an environment sensitive way." They have created a market for people like that. I think if we had a more competitive tech system, you would begin to see people who would make their proposition to we're the dictatorship free company, come with us, right? But right now nobody else can get a footing. And I think that, as somebody who thinks that markets have a real role to play, we are seeing a lot of barriers to the market forces playing out. And honestly, I think that's why you see people pushing for regulation across the board, is because they don't think that the market is providing them with the options that it ought to. And so they're looking for something more direct. And I can understand that, but I still think, you know, trying to level the playing field and create real markets so somebody can ask you and pitch to you a humane version of a phone that still works awesomely, um, to go against would really put a bright light on the fact that Apple doesn't want you to see what they're doing here, and give people the chance to vote with their feet.
And Apple really has their, for lack of a better term, Apple's balls are in a vice because they manufacture everything over in China as well. So their entire business model is dependent on China. It,
Yeah, and I mean, but they made those choices, and I think a lot of people were pretending like the Chinese government was not what it was. And also, I think a lot of people, there was this theory, and it was a theory when I was a kid, right around Tiananmen Square time, that, like if we engaged with more business in China, it would make China more friendly to human rights and anti-corruption and fairness. And I just think there's no evidence for that. In fact, it goes the other way, right? I think that the the engagement with China has not moved China towards the better. It's moved a lot of companies towards the worse. So we need to come up with a different strategy than trying to pretend like us making a lot of money off of China is also a virtuous, helping the Chinese people, because it doesn't appear that it is in terms of democracy and freedom and human rights.
I would agree on a lot of that, but I would say that it has moved the Chinese people. While it hasn't moved the Chinese government, I would say that a lot of those changes have occurred on an individual basis, but the individual trade offs of the prosperity that their government has brought has made it more worthwhile to give up those freedoms from a Chinese perspective.
Oh yeah, I think that, I mean, I want to be clear. I think you're right. I mean, I'm not talking about prosperity. I think the Chinese government has done a very good job of bringing a lot of people out of poverty, but it just hasn't, along with that has not come freedom and democracy and freedom and basic rights. And I think a lot of people were hoping that those two things would go together. And I think it's just painfully obvious now that they don't necessarily go together, that you also have to care about freedom and democracy and human rights, and not just care about prosperity if you really want to, if you want to build a world where people have freedom.
Capitalism and democracy are not necessarily completely intertwined.
I think Hong Kong is a really good example of this, right? I mean, we've seen a country that, a part of the world that used to have a lot of freedom slowly losing it as it becomes deeper and deeper embedded in the Chinese. And again, like, I just don't think that anybody who thinks that they're evidence-based can look at these situations and think that our theory that these two things would go together has been proven out. I think just the opposite. So, that means we need to pay attention to these values for themselves, uh, or else just be comfortable with creeping dictatorship, authoritarianism, and corruption around the world, which, if you think it's going to stay in China and not leak out to the rest of us, I think you're also missing the evidence.
Yeah, speaking of leaking, you kind of hinted at that earlier, but a lot of it appears to be our government is like, what are you guys doing? Some of this looks pretty good.
Yeah, I am worried about that, and I think that we're seeing a lot more of it, right? We're seeing a lot more embrace of corruption and a lot more looking at, kind of an anti-corrupt strategy as being looked upon as kind of weak and lame as
Also,
opposed to one that
surveillance.
is, yeah, well, then there's also surveillance,
That's what I
which
meant.
of course is well, thank you. Well, that's actually where I spend more of my time, right? I've been trying to stop the NSA from spying on everybody for since 2006. A good chunk of time before Mr. Snowden showed up and presented the world with kind of incontrovertible evidence that the U.S. government and the Five Eyes, that not just the U.S. government was attempting to spy on the entire world.
Attempting or succeeding?
Well, I think it's really hard to spy on the entire world. So one of the things we keep hearing whenever we see a FISA court decision or other kinds of decisions is that they actually can't do it very well. That doesn't mean it's not a problem. It's not that they're failing, but that actually trying to spy on the whole world so that you can figure out who's a bad guy is not doesn't work all that well. um, so
What's the
uh,
data? It's the data problem of how do you curate? How do you decide?
Correct. And that the kinds of things that they're trying to stop, at least the kinds of things that they're talking to you and me about trying to stop, which are things like terrorism, they don't really lend themselves to machine learning strategies where you can figure out who's a bad guy by looking at the other behavior of other people, because it turns out there's not enough training data and it's pretty hard to do. So again, they are absolutely collecting massive amounts of information off of key internet checkpoints, but the ability to turn that into something that really makes you and I safer is not at all demonstrated. In fact, the phone records program that they did in secret for a very long time and ended with the USA Freedom law turned out to have no impact on terrorism when they actually looked at it. So I think that the reason I say it doesn't work is I think it's not doing the things that they promised it would do, but they are still managing to collect a whole lot of information about a whole lot of people, and it's being misused.
When it grows, this is what scares me the most is every new crazy shooter, every terrorist attack is just another slippery excuse to add a little bit, to add a little
Yep.
bit, to add a little bit. And
Yep.
when you make something like that that can't really be cut down, it can only build bigger, you have massive problems.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, and I worry that right now we're kind of in this we're in that trapped position where there's no way to to do less surveillance. There's only a one-way ratchet, even though it doesn't have the kind of benefit that it was sold as. And then, of course, more importantly, like, that has a real impact on all the rest of us, right? I mean, people, the ability to have a private conversation is a core thing that makes us human and makes us free. And we are not in a place where we can have a private conversation online without using encryption. And of course, the government's coming after that too.
How do you think about that? What do consumers need to know and where are we headed?
Well, I think that consumers need to know that their ability to have a private conversation is on the line in these fights about encryption. I don't know where we're headed, but it's extremely troubling that we've see, Attorney General Barr and the two top officials, one from Australia and one from the UK, writing this letter to Facebook saying, "Don't you dare encrypt messaging." And fighting encryption all over the place. I think that the thing about encryption that I really care very much about privacy, but the thing about encryption is it's just a core part of our security, right? If you worry about data breaches, if you worry about your private information flowing out there in the world, encryption is your friend, right? It's the thing that helps give you security as well as privacy. And I think that the U.S. government anyway, and I think the Australian and the British government really, you know, um, are making the wrong move here. And I think the way that I like to explain what encryption does is, and what the government is trying to do is, let's just say that the local police came around to everybody's house and knocked on your door and said, look, we think there are some thieves in your neighborhood. So what we want you to do is leave your front door open, so that in case you're a thief, we can get in there and we can catch you. So is that okay? And I think most people would say, you've got to be kidding me. I want to lock my door, and I want a better lock on my door if you're telling me there's thieves in the neighborhood. And the police saying, no, that's not fair, because we might not be able to catch the thief unless we can run through your front door at some particular point in time. And don't worry, we won't misuse that. I think all the instincts that one might have in that situation are the right ones to have with encryption, which is, one, you're making me less safe to the bad guys with your strategy. You're not making me more safe. And two, I shouldn't be treated as if I'm your suspect. Do your police work and find your thief some other way. Don't find it by making me less safe.
But how do you push back when the people you're pushing back against have a monopoly on the use of force?
Well, I mean, some of what you do is you convince the public, right? I mean, things do fail in Congress. There was an effort by Senator Burr and Senator Feinstein to try to require companies to be able to provide the plain text of any message, and it died in the Senate. And it died in the Senate because ordinary people stood up and said, "No way, don't make us less safe." So, in the police. The police have some power, but they operate in the United States anyway within a framework of law. And if they only get the tools that the law lets them get. And so it's up to us to make sure that the law continues to stand with us. And, in the case of encryption, in the 1990s, my very first big case for EFF was making sure that the publication of encryption technology was protected by the First Amendment. The case was called Bernstein versus Department of Justice. And the U.S. government had taken the position that publishing encryption software on the internet violated the U.S. arms control laws. So, it was treated like a surface-to-air missile or a tank or something. And we sued in the courts and put a lot of political pressure both in the legislature and on the administration. And ultimately, the government backed down and freed up encryption from the regulatory regime. And that's why we have it now. Since the Snowden revelations, we've been able to, and EFF has been a central part of this, encrypt a huge amount of the web, right? It used to be that web connections were less than 10 to 20% encrypted. And this is, from web server to web server. So this isn't the consumer side of this. This is the back end of the web. And since then, we've gone to now close to 80% of connections on the back end of the web are encrypted. And that's because of the work that we've done with HTTPS everywhere. It's because of efforts that Google made after Mr. Snowden's revelation showed that the NSA was tapping into their connections between their servers. It's with work that we've done with Let's Encrypt, providing certificate authorities and making it easy for websites to provide a secure version of their websites. Right now, we're working on securing the DNS system, so that your queries when you go to look for a website are encrypted. So, we've made great strides in encrypting the back end of the internet. And, the government wasn't able to stop it. So, it takes a lot of vigilance. It's something that we work on all the time. And it takes companies being willing to stand up for strong encryption, unbreakable encryption, and not to fold when the government comes and put pressure on them. And this is an area where, I was critical of Apple earlier, and I've been very critical of Facebook, but Apple said no when the FBI showed up and told them that they had to break the encryption on iPhones after the San Bernardino shooting. Apple stood up for their users and said, no, we're not gonna break the encryption. And Facebook so far is standing firm and saying we're not going to break the encryption on WhatsApp just because you want us to. So it takes
that's them trying to merge the platform so they can't get broken up from regulation, though. That's the whole back end encryption and tying it all together from Zuckerberg's side. It has to be.
It certainly is, but I'm going to take the encryption benefits because it's going to save lives. Like I get that this is a strategy that Zuckerberg is using, but the strategy he's using is going to protect the privacy of literally millions of people around the world. And I think that I'm not a fan of them necessarily combining all three of them, but the fact that they're going to combine them and increase the encryption, don't get me wrong, I don't think it's a good idea for lots of competition reasons, but it is going to save lives. Encryption saves lives. And we don't see that in the United States nearly as much as we see it around the world. But believe me, we see it around the world. And so he's got a choice, right? He's going to combine these three systems. Is he going to combine them and give everybody encryption, or is he going to combine them and dumb it down and make WhatsApp not encrypted? And the fact that he's pinning his strategy on more encryption is good for the rest of us, and we need to keep the pressure on him so that that's what actually happens and that WhatsApp stays encrypted. WhatsApp and Apple phones provide more encryption, straight up for users than almost any other consumer facing tool, and we want to keep those companies committed to giving people secure options.
I would agree, and yet in China, and especially in Hong Kong, you don't use an iPhone because Apple's storing all their data in China now.
Yeah, well, I'm not saying that, look, anybody who does security understands about the need to have security in depth, and it depends on your threat model, right? If your threat model is somebody who might steal your phone, Apple's great because your phone sits encrypted at rest, right? They encrypt the data at rest. If your threat model is somebody who's going to go to Apple and give a subpoena to them to get the information, then that your threat you might do something different. You might want to not use the backups, right? I mean, you don't need to use remote backups for any phones. Local backups still exist, although they make it harder and harder every year. EFF has a whole thing called security self-defense, which is a set of tools and trainings for people, depending on who you are and what your threat model, about good security systems for you. But the kind of security you need, say if you're a domestic violence victim and your threat is your intimate partner who has access to your machine, is very different than the kind of threat model you have if you're worried about the Chinese government and you live in China. And there are different suggestions and kind of walking people through the various options and how to do it in the security self-defense materials. And if you're somebody who knows about security, because I suspect people in your audience are, we have something called the Security Education Companion, or SEC, which is a way for technical people to learn how to be good teachers of this, because just because you know how tech work doesn't mean that you know how to teach less technical people very well. So between SSD and SEC, we're hoping to empower people to make smart decisions about how to protect themselves in the current situation. And so there's different modules if you're a journalist, or if you're an activist, or if you're in a hostile government, or again, if your threat model is somebody in your own home.
And keep in mind, if it's digital, it can be hacked, guys. I want to jump to the lightning round. How's that sound, Cindy?
Sure.
And listeners, for you guys, the lightning round, it's some rapid fire questions with Cindy and with every guest. Some of the best and brightest questions that we've got. If you support us a level of $5 or more per month on Patreon, it's disruptors.fm/Patreon. That's Patreon. You unlock this, you unlock some bonus episodes, some free content, and a massive thank you from us because you help us make this sustainable. Jump back to the interview itself now. I got two last questions for you. What technology or trend are you most excited about, and why?
I think I'm most excited about the increasing interest of people who work in tech to think of themselves as part of the solution, and needing to be part of the solution, and whether we're seeing the protests that are happening inside tech companies, or the increasing number of people who want to work for organizations like EFF who have real technical skills. I think that it's exciting, and EFF has always been made up of people who understand about tech and want to make sure that it's used for good and not bad. We've always been there at that place, but that place is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's reaching people very far beyond the kind of few people who were part of this movement in the 90s, for instance. So it's exciting to me to see that getting better, to see people who think that having tech skills and understanding tech deeply doesn't mean that you sit on the sidelines about policy fights, especially policy fights about how tech is going to be used for the rest of us.
It's like the scientist. I invented it, but it's not mine to talk about. Yeah, that's not the way forward anymore.
It's not, and I think that was a rare thing. When I started out on this, it was, it was great. There were always lots of people who cared about this stuff. When we did the encryption fight, I had professors from all across the country who participated in convincing the court that we were right. But now I feel like we've just orders of magnitude more people in tech who really understand the implications and want to be on the side of right. And so, my job is to try to figure out how best to help those people get their voices heard and harness that power to really make the kind of changes that we need to see made.
And I want to let you get back to that. I got one last question before you tell people where to find you. And that's, if you had to leave people with one thing, a quote, a call to action, it can be anything, what would it be and why?
I think that my call to action would be to get involved. Don't think that technology is going to magically solve problems. So we need to kick in and make sure that we're working to make sure that technology supports users and empowers users and doesn't disempower users, and that people should stand up for their right to have a voice. I think that there is a risk among people to feel powerless around technology and to feel like, there just is Facebook and that's all the internet is and that's all it will ever be. And I think the thing I want to tell people is, we can make change. We have this power. It's not easy. It's not going to magically happen. It's not like a TV show where, it's done within the hour. But we can and will make really good change if people are willing to stand up and make their voices heard.
There's a great song. We got to fight for our right to party.
Correct.
Where is the best place for people to find you, Cindy?
EFF.org is our website. We're on Twitter. We are on Facebook. Any place you go, but specifically on the grand old internet, old school, www.eff.org is the best place to find us. But take a look. We have such a range of activity. Our blog is very active. Our Twitter feed is very active. You can see all the issues we work on. I suspect you might not agree with us about everything, but I suspect for everybody out there listening, there's at least one issue where EFF has got your back, and so come find out and come join us.
Well, there's definitely a lot that have your back. They might disagree, but they definitely got your back. Thanks for coming on today, Cindy.
All right, thank you.
And thanks for tuning in, guys. If you liked it, share it around. This is important. It's the future of all of us, our privacy, our lives, the avoidance of Minority Report. Share it with a friend, family member. And if you run a business, company, you want to get in front of our awesome audience and you've got a net positive product, service, etc. you want to promote, reach out, matt@disruptors.fm. Until next time, go make it happen and cover those cameras. Zuckerberg does.